محمد وآل محمد صلوات. محمد وآل محمد صلوات. Brothers and sisters, we'd like to continue the program with the recitation of the Holy Quran by Haider and Ibrahim Asaria. Please welcome them with a loud salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. أما يتساءلون عن النبأ العظيم الذي هم فيه مختلفون كلا سيعلمون ثم كلا سيعلمون لم نجعل الأرض مهادا والجبال أوتادا وخلقناكم أزواجا وجعلنا نومكم سباتا وجعلنا الليل لباسا وجعلنا النهار معاشا وبنينا فوقكم سبعا شدادا وجعلنا سراجا وهاجا وأنزلنا من المعصرات ماء ثجاجا لنخرج به حبا ونباتا وجنات ألفافا إن يوم الفصل كان ميقاتا يوم ينفخ في الصور فتأتون أفواجا وفتحت السماء فكانت أبوابا وسيرت الجبال فكانت سرابا.
إن جهنم كانت مرصادا للطاغين مآبا لابثين فيها أحقابا لا يذوقون فيها بردا ولا شرابا إلا حميما وغساقا جزاء وفاقا إنهم كانوا لا يرجون حسابا وكذبوا بآياتنا كذابا وكل شيء نسيناه كتابا فذوقوا فلن نزيدكم إلا عذابا إن للمتقين مفازا حدائق وأعنابا وكواعب ترابا وكأسا دهاقا لا يسمعون فيها لغوا ولا كذابا جزاء من ربك عطاء حسابا رب السماوات والأرض وما بينهم الرحمن لا يملك منه خطابا يوم يقوم الروح والملائكة صفا لا يتكلمون إلا من أذن له الرحمن وقال صوابا ذلك اليوم الحق فمن شاء اتخذ إلى ربه مآبا إنا أنذرناكم عذابا قريبا يوم ينظر المرء ما قدمت يداه ويقول الكافر يا ليتني كنت ترابا صدق الله العظيم.
Brothers and sisters, we'd like to continue the program with the main talk by Mohammad Mahdi Karim on Can You Maintain Your Faith in UK Politics? Please welcome him with a loud salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. I'm sure many of you know Mohammad Mahdi very well. He is the founder of the MMK Academy, a social enterprise which helps children and young adults to improve their public speaking skills and increases access for young Muslims to the world of politics. He was also the UK's G20 Youth Delegate in 2022, where he represented the views of young people across the UK at the G20 Youth Summit in Jakarta in Indonesia. Today he'll be speaking about about Can You Maintain Your Faith in UK Politics? Please welcome with a loud salawat again. Allah Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. Firstly, I think after being on the receiving end of these talks about 100, 200 times, it feels a bit strange being here today. But firstly, I'd like to thank Murphil for giving me this opportunity. I'm proud to say that I've been part of the community since birth, and it feels quite special to be able to do this today. And in particular, thank you to Miqdad, who reached out to me. He's been on the case for a while, actually, and initially I said, no, I don't think I'm ready. But I think this is a topic that I've been thinking about for quite a while now, and hopefully I've got some insights to share today. So this is how I want this talk to progress. I'll give a bit of an introduction about myself and also a bit about my background, a bit of the experiences as well that shape my views in terms of answering this question. And then the third part is answering the question, should we even get involved in UK politics in the first place? Because before we answer how can we, I think it's important to understand if we should in the first place. Fourth element will then be talking about how we get involved, and then we'll be moving on to some conclusions, and hopefully we can wrap up with some interesting questions, and no pressure. But the more difficult the questions shows that the more you've been listening, so I'm expecting some juicy ones at the end. So yeah, look, as I've said, my name's Mohammad Mahdi Karim. I'm 22 years old. I will be going into commercial law. That's going to be what I'll be doing for the next few years ahead. But I'm also the founder of an MMK Academy, and more on that later. But I think this picture illustrates quite nicely the fact that Murphil's been a home since birth. This is during Ramadan, I think. And yeah, once again, thank you very much for this opportunity. In terms of giving an introduction, I think that there have been 6 pivotal points within my journey so far that have shaped my views. And we'll go through each one of them in turn briefly. The purpose of this is not so much to be a biography, but it's to give you a flavour of where my experiences come from. But also a number of these opportunities are things that young people can get involved in as well. So if you're a parent in the room thinking of an opportunity for your child, then feel free to look at some of these. And also if you're a young person yourself, try and think about getting involved with some of these later on. So I think it all starts from my parents. This is, the two people who got me interested in politics in the first place. We can look back in sort of 2013, which was around the time that I started getting involved in this topic in the first place. My dad in particular would take me to events like Mehdi Hassan's debates in Oxford. And there was one event in particular at Westminster called Breaking the Glass Ceiling that happened in 2013. And you can see a very young me in that third picture there, that really gave me my first flavour of politics. And this was an event where Sadiq Khan, who was an MP at the time, was speaking alongside some other Muslim and ethnic minority MPs. And they were talking about breaking the glass ceiling. So the fact that at that time there weren't many people in Parliament of an ethnic minority background. And they were talking about their experience of how they got there, and some of the challenges they face, but also some of the positives of having Muslims and ethnic minority members in politics. And for me, I didn't quite understand very much about what went on, but I remember back then thinking that this is quite cool, seeing someone of my background in this space, which I know is quite special, right? Big Ben, House of Parliament was special, so it was quite nice seeing a Muslim there. But I didn't really understand much more than that. But it was nice to feel represented. And just on the whole aspect of parents, alhamdulillah, they've been a continuous source of support and have continued supporting me at recent events, which we'll come and talk to more in the future. Now, this event in 2013 was organised by a foundation called the Patchwork Foundation. And the Patchwork Foundation do some excellent work in increasing access to young ethnic minority members of the UK and increasing their access to politics. So in 2016 and in 2015 actually as well, they held canvassing sessions with Sadiq Khan. In 2015 this was for the general election, and in 2016 this was for his mayoral campaign as well. So the Patchwork Foundation allowed me to get involved at a more deeper level in understanding politics and actually getting out there, getting your hands dirty, canvassing for these politicians. In 2020, it opened up another opportunity, which is their masterclass. Now, their Patchwork Masterclass is an opportunity which allows 18 to 30-year-olds to be mentored by senior politicians, journalists, and members of the civil service. And this was a mentoring session that I had the honour to lead. Whilst Matt Hancock has probably plummeted in everyone's estimations over the last couple of years, this was in 2020, at the height of the pandemic, when he was Secretary of State for Health. So we had access to someone who was quite literally running the country in the middle of a health emergency, and getting a bit of an insight in terms of how he's coping, how the NHS is coping, and if it can cope going forward. And I remember that being quite a pivotal moment as well. So, you know, Patchwork was great for increasing access to politics. Very briefly then, it was MUN, a skill that I actually picked up from Madrasa in 2015, that enabled me to gain some level of speaking proficiency. And politics and speaking are two themes which will run concurrently throughout this presentation. But it was MUN that allowed me to actually transform from someone who was quite timid, shy, couldn't really put very many sentences together, into someone who could speak coherently in public. And actually that passion that I got from MUN then allowed me to bring MUN to my school from Madrasa. And we organised a number of... MUN, good question. MUN is Model United Nations for... So MUN is a simulation of the United Nations. Essentially, each young person takes a country and they debate on different policies. So it could be something to do with climate change, and you represent America, and someone else represents the UK, and you pretend to be people in charge making decisions about these different world issues. So not only does it improve your political knowledge, but also it improves your ability to speak as well. So we brought this to school and held numerous political events to basically get more young people passionate about politics. So in 2016, we organised an event with Dominic Grieve, who I'm sure many of you know, who comes to the Muslim News Gala dinner quite a bit. And he talked about Brexit, because this was a week before the Brexit referendum, and he was going through why Brexit would be a terrible idea. But that was through the MUN Society. And the MUN Society also allowed myself to go to St. Petersburg to take part in an international debating competition in Russia. And we also hosted our own conference at Challiners as well. So MUN was that tool and that vehicle that enabled me to improve my speaking proficiency. We then move on to the third kind of pivotal moment in this journey, and that was the MMK Academy, which was formed in 2020, right at the beginning of the lockdown. So I was in first year uni, and university told me that basically the pandemic hit in March, or actually lockdown hit in March to be more specific, that your term 3 would be cancelled, your exams would be cancelled, and you'd have nothing on for the next 6 months, at least until September. And initially I started to panic. You know, what am I going to do? The whole country's gone into lockdown. I don't have anything to do. So I started putting together applications for just working at a local supermarket. And a neighbour approached me and said, look, I know you've done a bit of work in MUN. Could you please have a go at, sitting with my child who lacks confidence and seeing if you can improve their ability to communicate, public speaking skills, basically. And I never say no to opportunities like that. So I sat down and took some of the material that I'd sort of put together through my MUN days, and obviously made it adaptable so that I could deliver it to a young child. And I delivered that session for a week with the young neighbour. And at the end of the week, I realised two things. Firstly, this is scalable. There are going to be a number of children across the country who struggle to speak, and a number of parents who want their children to improve in this skill. And at the same time, we've just had a lockdown been imposed, which means that these children can't play sports outdoors. They can't do the things that they usually do under normal circumstances, so we can do these sessions on Zoom. But the second thing I realized was that I really, really enjoyed this, and I could grow it. And alhamdulillah, over the last 3 years, we've diversified into working not only with young children, but also adults. We work with schools, we work with charities, businesses, and essentially at the core of what we do is we want to make sure that everyone, regardless of their background or level of education, is equipped with the ability to speak confidently, because that is one of life's key skills, but unfortunately it's something that we're not really taught how to do in schools. So whilst we're taught how to get A's and A stars, and that's fantastic, the A's and A stars will only get you up to a certain point in terms of an interview, but you need to be able to speak at that interview to go any further. And these are some of the statistics as to what we've achieved over the last 3 years. Highlights have been working with nearly 1,000 individuals and also engaging over 3,000 young people across schools and youth groups as well, including Mahfil. And for those of you who've been coming to the Friday lectures before, there's usually a youth lecture, which is the product of some of these sessions. We then move on to the G20, and this was during my third year of university. I saw an opportunity on LinkedIn where the government was recruiting someone to represent young people's views across the country at the G20. So the G20 is a group of the 20, if you like, most powerful countries around the world, and they meet every year in a different location to discuss various different things, for example, the global economy, climate change, what they're going to do about tech regulation, for example. And the G20 has lots of different offshoots. So they have the U20, Urban 20, which is where the top mayors from these 20 countries meet. They have the T20, which is where the top technology leaders from these 20 countries meet. And they also had something called the Y20, which is where young representatives from these countries would go to the summit, and they would represent the views of the young people within their country. So I was selected as the head delegate for the UK in 2022, and it allowed me to go out to Indonesia and represent the views of young people in this country. And one of the most prevalent things that young people spoke about in terms of things that they were frustrated about was the fact that youth unemployment was quite high. And they felt that they weren't really taught at school so-called employability skills. So they'd be taught these core curricular subjects, but they'd never be taught how to be employed, if you like. And a big part of that was how to communicate. And I feel that that's sort of a reason why I was selected in the first place, given the experience of the MMK Academy and the work that I did in promoting soft skills education. And so the key policy that we were actually advocating for, believe it or not, was to introduce public speaking classes by the curriculum by 2025. Now, luck has it that Keir Starmer has, as one of his key manifesto pledges for the next general election, the fact that he's going to try and introduce oracy classes, which is basically public speaking classes, if he gets into power. I'm not saying that we had anything to do with that at all, but it was the cherry on the cake to see that happen. But it also opened up opportunities to speak at places like Chatham House, which is also very, very cool. On to the penultimate experience point then. So we worked with young people to improve their public speaking skills at the MMK Academy. And what we found very early on was the way that we got young people to speak confidently was to speak about something that they were passionate about. And that often revolved around a political topic. So it would be homelessness or climate change, because people have opinions about these things, and that is the best way to get them to speak, to hear their opinions. And so as we moved on and started to speak, to teach public speaking through political themes, a lot of the young people who were predominantly Muslim would come up to me and say, well, how can we further our knowledge in this political space? And, I saw an opportunity there. Patchwork had been fantastic to me in opening up my access to politics, but Patchwork dealt with the BME community at large. I thought it was time for an organisation to be there which focused exclusively on Muslims, because the Muslim challenge is very, very different to the general BME challenge. There are certain things, certain aspects of our faith that need special care and attention that sometimes we weren't really given the space to discuss when you had other groups of people there as well. So that is how the politics side started. And our aim with the MMK Academy's politics side was to ensure that young Muslims had an increased access to politics, much like Patchwork had given me, but this was for the young Muslims of our community. So our inaugural event was earlier this year in association with the Muslim News, where we got 100 young people together at Speaker's House in Parliament, and they were in front of 7 Muslim politicians, and the Muslim politicians were talking about individual challenges that they'd faced as Muslims to getting into politics and how they'd overcome those challenges. We then had an event with Naz Shah MP and Afzal Khan MP, again delving deeper into some of the specific challenges that Muslims face when it comes to politics and this idea of balancing faith. And we also took some young people along to Mehdi Hassan's book launch in collaboration with Intelligence Squared. And the final pivotal point that have shaped my views on this topic is over the summer, I got the opportunity for 6 weeks to work with Naz Shah MP. And I think, I say this a lot, but in those 3 weeks, I probably learned a lot more about the UK political scene than 3 years at uni studying politics. It was phenomenal, great to be immersed in the system, but it also gave me a lot of insights that changed my perspective on this topic. And that's why I feel ready now to give my opinions on this topic, as opposed to giving it 6 months ago when I wasn't quite sure on the answers. So let's get into the substance. I hope that's given you a bit of a flavour as to where I've derived my views from. This is a very broad question, right? We are dealing with lots of big concepts, faith, politics. So I think it's important to define them before we move on, and also outline some caveats about how I'm going to answer this question. So when it comes to faith, I'd like to focus specifically on Islam. But faith is this belief in a higher power or a divine being, or a set of principles that's outlined by, in this case, Islam. And this belief is something that guides our actions, our day-to-day behaviors, and also influences our values as well. And I've defined politics purposefully quite broadly, actually. And it's basically, politics, if you like, is the art of making decisions or the art of influencing power. And these decisions are usually made either on an individual level, but more likely on a group level as well. And there are certain caveats that I'd like to outline as well. So firstly, I'm not a scholar, so this analysis is not going to be scholarly. Although, interestingly, there is very, very little work out there on the role of a Shia Muslim in the West, let alone the role of a Shia Muslim in terms of getting involved in politics. So the scholar Liaquat Taqim has done a bit of work on the role of Shia Muslims in the West, but virtually no scholar has done any work on the responsibility of Shia Muslims to get involved in the political scene. I'm also not an academic. I haven't, researched this to a academic standard in a lot of depth. I have done some research, and so my views come from an experiential point of view, with a bit of theory intertwined as well. This is also a subjective area, because faith means different things to different people and can be expressed differently by people as well. So these are very much my opinions too. And even though I feel a bit more comfortable in sharing my views are still maturing as well. And, they've changed a lot over the last year. They could potentially change over the next few years as well. But I feel a lot more comfortable sharing them now than I have in the past. And this question is something that I think we ought to answer now more than ever, because we see often, more and more often, this concept of faith and politics clashing in the media. So it comes up in the media quite a bit. Sadiq Khan, someone who I canvassed for before, has brought a lot of pride and happiness to Muslim communities in increasing representation. But at the same time, he is arguably one of the most pro-LGBT politicians in the country. And that's left a lot of Muslims scratching their heads to say, okay, he brings us a lot of pride, but how does he then balance his faith with his politics? This topic got brought up again recently during the Scottish leadership election when Hamza Yusuf, who's now the First Minister of Scotland, was called out because in 2014 he missed out on the opportunity to vote to basically legalise gay marriage in Scotland, and he just didn't turn up. And we'll discuss this case study in a bit more depth later on, so we'll park it for now. It's even led some MPs to say that being Muslim disadvantages us from progressing in politics. So Nusrat Ghani, who's a Conservative female MP, said that actually I was sacked from my position because of my Muslimness, because of the fact that I was Muslim. And it's even led some members of parliament in prominent positions, such as Tim Farron, to quit because he simply could not balance his faith with politics. And it's also an interesting time because as Muslims, we are represented at the top levels. Right? We've got a mayor of London who's a Muslim, the leader of the Scottish Labour Party who's a Muslim, Anas Sarwar, the First Minister of Scotland who's a Muslim, Hamza Yusuf. But at the same time, as a demographic, we are still severely underrepresented. So we've got 650 MPs at the moment, of which we have 18 Muslim MPs. But as I've mentioned, 6.5% of the population of England and Wales is Muslim. So, this is a very rough extrapolation because we don't have the details of Scotland, but roughly about 42 MPs would be representative of our population in the UK. So I've categorized these challenges broadly as two sets of challenges. Firstly, you've got the external challenge of maintaining your faith in politics. And that external challenge comes from the fact that as a society, we're becoming increasingly more secular. I remember that when I was at school, primary school, society still had a semblance of God. You'd sing your hymns. Things revolved around this notion of God, albeit in a Christian setting. Now, when I work with young people at primary schools, this sense of religion seems to have completely gone away. And I think that's a fair representation of society as a whole, that we are becoming increasingly more secular. And that's why debates such as the whole LGBT debate seem to be becoming more prevalent. But at the same time as this external challenge, you've also got the internal challenge of increasing levels of Islamophobia, which make it more difficult for Muslims to progress in society. And so this concept of balancing or maintaining faith in politics has two separate challenges, the external challenge and the internal challenge as well. So moving on to the question of should we get involved, because if we shouldn't get involved in the first place, then we can close this chapter and go home. Because the simple answer is just to abstain, and we don't need to be having this conversation. I guess to answer this question, should we get involved, a large part of this would come down to what are our motivations as a community for getting involved in the first place? Is it because as a Muslim community we want to have increased influence? Is it the fact that we want to make up the numbers in terms of representation? Is it the fact that we're sick and tired that current politicians don't represent our views and we want to actually make them more representative of what we believe? Or is it a way that we can simply enact our faith? And this is a vehicle that allows us to enact our faith as well. And I guess depending on what the motivations are, depending on that, we can then answer this question of should we get involved. But in my mind, it's clear that we should, and I think we should for 3 reasons. 2 of them are driven by our faith, and 1 of them is driven by a slightly separate factor. So the 2 factors driven by our faith in terms of why we should get involved are, firstly, Allah says in the Quran in Surah 13 verse 11 that Allah will not change the condition of a people unless they change themselves. Now the tafsir around this verse predominantly revolves around internal change. So God will not change the position of a community unless their morals and ethics and etiquette changes. But just imagine a child who you're trying to nurture. Simply trying to change their etiquette and morals will not be enough. In order to sustain that change in the long term, what you need to be able to do is change society around them to make that sustainable change. Because if you put a child with good morals in a society that has substandard morals, the child's ethics will then wane. So the society around needs to match the internal as well. So when God talks about this element of change in the individual, some mufassir also extend that to change in the society around. Secondly, in numerous verses in the Quran, God talks about the fact that humans are stewards on this earth, and we have a responsibility to look after this earth. So in Surah 2, verse 30, Allah says, "Remember when your Lord said to the angels, I'm going to place a successive human authority on earth." And this concept of authority or stewardship means that we have this duty to look after the earth and make sure that, for example, when it comes to climate change, we don't make sure that it exacerbates too much. The third point then as to why we need to get involved is because the systems or the current politicians out there simply don't represent our views enough. And there's a problem. If you look at this chart up here, it's a bit small, but essentially if you get people who think in the same way to lead you, then the range of solutions that they'll come up with will be very, very limited. Look at the bottom box, right? That is, imagine the box is the total possible range of solutions that you could have. And if each individual comes from the same background, inevitably they'll think in the same way, and they're not going to cover the broad range of solutions that could possibly be given to solve some of these big, big challenges in society. But if we then start to recruit our politicians and our leaders from diverse backgrounds, that means that the way that they think and the experiences that they've had will enable them to cover those spaces and cover the solutions which haven't been thought of before because their experiences have been different. And so this term is coined cognitive diversity. The fact is that if you want to come up with innovative solutions, and we need innovative solutions because the problems we face at the moment are mammoth, then you need to recruit people from different backgrounds because their scope of thought will be able to cover all of these different problems that you face and come up with innovative solutions to them. So for those 3 reasons, I think that we need to get involved. And that begs the question then, how do we get involved? And naturally, when we look at this topic, a lot of people turn to frontline politicians, as I've done in this presentation already, because that is the group of people that we see on a day-to-day basis on our televisions. And those are the groups of people that we see potentially compromising their faith with their politics. So to answer this question about whether MPs can balance their faith with politics, it's important to understand what the role of an MP actually is. And there are 2 models that people sort of view MPs as being. The first model is the trustee model, and the second model is the delegate model. So forget about these fancy terms. Let's try and explain these quite simply. The trustee model is that MPs are elected by us because we believe as people that they have the experience to represent us. So we're not electing them necessarily because they will represent us word for word. We put our faith in them because we trust that they've got the experience to make decisions on behalf of us that will be the best possible decisions. Thank you very much. Contrast that with the delegate model. The delegate model is a model where you elect a member of parliament to simply be a mouthpiece. They are literally a bridge between you, your views, and the political world. And their role is simply to convey what you think to the political world. So contrast that with the trustee model, where you're electing someone because you feel that they are the best possible person to make a decision on your behalf, with the delegate model, where people are simply a mouthpiece for what you believe in. And these two models are important because whether you subscribe to the trustee view or the delegate view will make a difference in how we answer this question of maintaining your faith in politics. Now, in theory, in the UK, our MPs are meant to be trustees. So we elect these people because we trust that they have the experience to make the best decisions on our behalf. Churchill summed it up by saying that the first duty of a member of parliament is to do what he thinks is, in his faithful and disinterested judgment, the right and the necessary thing for the honour and safety of Great Britain. So the MP does what he or she thinks is best for the country, irrespective of whether that differs with what the majority of people in their area believe. So that's in theory. But in reality, it's not so clear-cut, because firstly, from an electoral perspective, if you make a decision based off what you think is in the best interest of the country, but that doesn't really follow what the country believes, then that's not very good in terms of your chances of getting elected at the next general election. Imagine if I believed that all school children should be given chocolates. And I'd done some research based off that, and I believe that everyone should be given chocolates. But the majority of the country believe that actually, no, that's not a good idea. If I then went ahead in my best judgment and made that decision, electorally that would be quite bad, because I'm going against what the majority of the country believe. But it's what I think is in the best interest of the country. So from an electoral perspective, MPs tend to veer towards this delegate model of we'll simply be mouthpieces for the areas that we represent. And a classic example in reality of this was Brexit, because the majority of MPs, when it came to the Brexit referendum, actually believed that Brexit was not a very good thing. But then you had rhetoric coming out like, well, you're going to go against the will of the people, or this is anti-democratic if you vote Brexit down. And that was quite interesting, because actually MPs could have voted Brexit down, and that would have been well in line with their ability to act as trustees, to act as people who have faith put in them to make the best decision, and they could have done that totally legitimately. But the way that they acted was more in line with the delegate model. They acted as mouthpieces for the rest of the country. So, important. Trustees, we elect trustees because we think that they'll make the right decision, and that decision could be very different to what we believe. And delegates, we elect them to simply be a mouthpiece. So when it comes to answering this question of maintaining faith in politics, if you look at the delegate model, the typical delegate politician will say that actually we don't really have a choice. Our job is simply to be a mouthpiece. It's to represent the people that we serve. So this question of maintaining faith in politics is actually redundant. It shouldn't even be a question in the first place, because our private life and our public life are two completely separate domains that shouldn't mix. We have a role as a public officer to be a mouthpiece for the people that we serve, and our private views are separate. So we don't really have a choice. And a very good example of someone who showed these kind of characteristics was Humza Yousaf in this most recent Scottish leadership election. So to paint the picture a bit more, Humza Yousaf is a Muslim, practicing Muslim. And in 2014, Scotland had a vote to equalise gay marriage, and he didn't turn up for that. And earlier this year, when he was standing to become leader of the Scottish National Party, the SNP, questions were raised as to, well, why didn't you turn up? Are you homophobic? Are you anti-LGBT? If you come into power, are you going to rule as a Muslim who believes that LGBT or being gay is a sin? You know, why didn't you turn up? And initially the answer he gave is that he didn't turn up for personal reasons, and his views on the LGBT matter was, whilst he can't change what is in scripture, he will not allow personal faith to be the basis of legislation. So if we go back to the slide before, remember how I said that they want to separate the public life from the private life? This is a classic way of, well, whilst I can't change what is in scripture, that will not influence my politics because I have a duty to represent my people and be a mouthpiece for them. Eventually, he was pressured into giving his opinion, and he gave his opinion that actually, I believe that people's marriage, even if they're gay, are equal to people who have a straight marriage. Contrast that to actually Kate Forbes, who was one of his competitors, who came from a very, very strong Christian Orthodox background, who said that if I was in Hamza Yusuf's position, I would not have voted to equalise gay marriage because of my strong Christian beliefs. So that is the delegate model, and with a nice example there. Now, there are some MPs, especially those in Westminster at the moment, and especially backbench MPs, who exhibit more of the attributes of a trustee. So remember, a trustee is someone who we as the public elect because we think that they're going to make the best decision on our behalf. Now, the thing with a trustee is because they make decisions based off their past experience, they can bring faith into the question. So unlike the delegate model, where they say faith and our private life is separate from our public role, under the trustee model, MPs can bring that faith element into the question. But they also have to compromise their faith with a number of different competing influences. They've got their party's influence, what their party believes. They've also got what their constituency, their local area believes as well. So you've got a number of these different conflicting viewpoints that these MPs need to balance. So the first question is, with a trustee, whilst you might be able to balance all of these different views of party, local, and private views when you're junior, as you become more senior, some of these different influences become stronger and some of them start to drop. And the key question we need to answer is, well, which ones get stronger and which ones start to drop? And from the conversations that I've had with Muslim members of parliament, it often tends to be that the higher up you go in politics, the more senior you become, the party line strengthens. So this party hat, if you like, tightens. And your private views and the values that brought you into politics in the first place weaken, and they start to get thrown away. And so that potentially could be a problem because the party line often could conflict with what your private faith views are. And so maybe the higher up you go, the less able you are to maintain your faith in politics. So then I had a particular conversation with a Muslim MP who is a minister, shadow minister. And they said that, and so that means that they are quite senior. And I was like, okay, so how do you then maintain your faith with your politics the higher up you go? And this was, a view that they gave. And I've simplified their view by using an example. So let's think of a scenario where you've got a Muslim MP who needs to vote on gay marriage. Their faith instinctively would tell them to vote no. Their party line might be yes. And let's assume that in this scenario, the majority of MPs are going to vote yes. So the MP that I had a conversation with about maintaining their faith in politics said, look, we don't necessarily view our decisions when it comes to balancing faith with politics from a choice point of view. We look at it more from the outcome. So we don't necessarily look at, the decision we're making from the perspective of, so let me put this another way. We don't necessarily look at our act, we look at the outcome. And the outcome, number one, if we voted no, so voting no would be in line with our faith but against our party, the positive of that will be, okay, at least we've maintained our faith. But the negative of that will be that we haven't changed the outcome of the vote, and at the same time, if it's a contentious issue, we are likely to have lost our position of influence because our party might have a rule where if you don't vote in favour, you might get kicked off, or you might lose your position of influence. So, okay, you've maintained your faith, But the negative side is you've lost your position of influence and you haven't changed the outcome of the vote. Outcome number 2 might be, okay, if I vote yes, that might contradict with my faith, but in terms of the outcome, voting yes is not going to change the outcome, right? So I look at it from the perspective of I haven't actually changed any outcomes, and I've maintained my position of influence, which is important because that might allow me to be more pro-Muslim and achieve certain pro-Muslim policies in the future. But the negative is that I have then gone against my principles. And so this particular person, in this particular person's opinion, they believed that the second outcome was more beneficial in the longer term because it allowed them to maintain their position of influence, to be a greater force for the Muslim community in the long term, even though they had to make a short-term sacrifice. But that left me thinking, okay, with other aspects in life, we might believe that we can make short-term sacrifices in terms of getting a long-term gain, but can we ask that same question when it comes to faith? And I wasn't particularly convinced because I've never looked at faith as we'll make some compromises here if in the long term we'll end up achieving the ultimate goal. Faith is very much, a set of beliefs or values that you hold dearly and in a way for me are non-compromisable. So I wasn't particularly convinced with the answer, but that is a common view of how senior Muslim politicians balance their faith with their politics. And Sadiq Khan often says politics is the art of compromise, so you're never going to get the perfect solution. And another argument that the MPs kind of give in terms of why we need to compromise is this common phrase, which is, if you don't have a seat around the table, then you'll be on the menu. Simply means if you don't have a position at a table where you have influence, then you'll end up being on the menu because the people who make the decisions will make decisions without your view in mind completely. But actually, we can find examples where people who've ended up on the table, had a seat at the table, have actually ended up being on the menu anyway. So people who have tried to balance their faith with politics have ended up having to resign. And we mentioned the example of Tim Farron earlier because he couldn't balance his Christian faith with the Liberal Democrats' view on gay marriage. And he actually later ended up saying, I regret saying that gay marriage is not a sin. He was forced to say that in his position as Lib Dem leader, but it's something that he regretted. But recently, as recent as June this year, in Bradford, you had a Muslim mayor, Mohammad Nazim, who attended a pride march, held up the flag, apologized privately in a group and shared that in the group. Someone on the group then took a screenshot and shared that on Facebook. And it then led to people calling him homophobic because he apologized on that private group for holding up the pride flag. So he was labeled as homophobic, or he was labeled as someone who is not an ally of the LGBT community. And he was forced to resign because on the one hand, he held the pride flag up, but at the same time, he was then he then apologized for doing that to his local Muslim community, and he faced this conflict between faith and politics. So my conclusion as to whether you can balance faith with politics from a perspective of the MP level is I don't think it's clear-cut. And I'm unsure, really am unsure as to, at the moment, and the key word is at the moment, whether you can maintain your faith and also be a frontline politician. But that begs the question to say, well, if we can't do that, then what do we do? Because in answer to our earlier question of should we get involved, the answer is clearly yes. So we can't abstain, but we ought to still get involved in some way. So how? If we can't do it at the moment as a frontline politician, then how do we do it? And the answer lies in chocolate. So can I have a young volunteer to answer this question for me? Who you had your hand up first? Is it Ilyas? Idris, sorry. Idris, what's your favourite chocolate bar? Out of the 3 on board. Kit Kat, okay. So Idris, I've given you a choice of 3 chocolate bars, and you've chosen Kit Kat, right? Who has the power in that situation, you or me? Why?
Because you give me the choice of which chocolate bars to choose, and I've got the power to
Excellent. Fantastic. So we both have the power, but I'd say I have more power than you. Because I gave Idris a choice of 3 chocolates, right? Dairy Milk, Galaxy, Kit Kat. And he chose that his favorite was Kit Kat, okay? So he had the power to choose 1 from 3. But I've had the power to constrict his choice of 3 from 500. There are 500 plus chocolate bars out there. And my power has been in making him choose 1 out of 3. So I have narrowed 500 down to 3. He's narrowed 3 to 1. So we both have power, but I have more power, I'd say, in this sort of scenario. So whilst Idris has been a decision maker of choosing which chocolate bar to pick, he's chosen what should be the final choice. I have been able to set the agenda of those 3 chocolate bars, so I'm known as something called an agenda setter. So my role in this is what should the focus of the choice be in the first place. But there is a group of people who have even more power than me, and they're known as preference shapers. So why are we even talking about chocolate bars in the first place? Why aren't we talking about cakes or biscuits or sweets or even fruits? And the preference shapers are the group of people in society who basically determine the question, what are we even deciding in the first place? So Idris, as a decision maker, has determined what should be the final choice. I, as the agenda setter, have basically told him what should be the focus of the choice. And the preference shapers in society have dictated to me, well, what am I even deciding in the first place? So what does this look like in politics? So the decision makers are your MPs. And going back to this example of having 3 choices, this is quite an accurate representation of the level of decisions that MPs actually have. MPs don't have a free reign of choice. They can't decide, I want to do this, I'm going to do this now. There are a number of external factors that come into play which narrow down their decision into only actually having 1, 2, or 3 choices from which they can choose between. So your MPs are your final decision makers. They choose what should be the final choice. And even then, there is a bit of their hands are tied because you've got their party line and you've got the fact that things need to get through on a majority. You've then got organizations in society who are the agenda setters. And remember, the agenda setters are the ones who narrow down, well, out of the 500 things we could be choosing from, what are the 3 things that the MPs will have to decide between? Now, the agenda setters when it comes to politics are various. You could include the MCB in this group. You could include think tanks like the Institute for Economic Affairs, who are very, very influential in shaping Liz Truss's thoughts. And Liz Truss's absolutely abysmal budget, well, that was all the Institute of Economic Affairs. Backbench MPs have a big role to play in what should be the choice that maybe frontline, especially senior politicians, have. People like Dominic Cummings also can constrict the choice of politicians, and Dominic Cummings was a senior advisor. And then if you take a step forward with this group called the preference shapers who decide, well, what should we be deciding in the first place? The media come into this. So people like Sky News, even your social media, your Twitters, your Metas, they have a big role to play in terms of what should be decided in the first place. What should be the area of focus? Our schools and educational institutes have a big role in deciding, well, what is the thought that people leave with and how are people going to think when it comes to politics. People, external sort of champions like Greta Thunberg also could be preference shapers. The fact that she goes on about climate change, has raised the profile of climate change, means that she has put climate change on the map when it wasn't really talked about before. So she could be classed as a preference shaper. And so there are different groups who come into this group, this sort of lens in terms of, well, what are we even deciding? And so from this perspective, we realize that MPs don't have that much power. And in a way, the reason why they might have to compromise their faith when it comes to politics is because the agenda that's being set for them, the final three choices that they have, might be being made by organizations that don't have the view of Islam at their core, and therefore they're being asked to make decisions on three choices that never will compromise with their faith. And so then surely the solution to that is that we need more Muslim agenda setters and Muslim-orientated preference shapers, so that pressure can be applied to narrow down the choices that our decision makers have to enable them to be more in line with Islamic values. So surely the influence is, or the route is influence from the outside in, so that these external groups can apply enough pressure to make sure that the three choices that the politicians have might be more in line with our Islamic values. But so far, it hasn't been that straightforward. And I'll give two examples of how Muslim-backed groups have tried to achieve choices that would benefit the Muslim community, but have faced a bit of a barrier. The first one is Islamic finance student loans. So a group, I think if I'm not mistaken, led by the MCB, wanted, as early back in 2013 when David Cameron was the Prime Minister, to ensure that student loans had an Islamic finance alternative, because a number of Muslim students felt that they were compromising their faith by having to take out a student loan. And the MCB, alongside a number of key influential stakeholders, applied pressure on the government. But the outcome is that we haven't seen that rolled out yet. The government keeps on pushing it back and delaying it. And now the latest line on that is that it could be rolled out in 2026. But even then, I'm not too hopeful. So that's an example of how pressure from the outside in has worked to a certain extent of getting this on the table. So the MCB in their role has been an effective preference shaper and even getting this on the table to be decided, but it hasn't really managed to set the agenda in the way that it wants to. The second example is simply adopting a definition for Islamophobia. Now, the main party, the Conservative Party, who are currently in power at the moment, do not want to recognize a definition for Islamophobia. And you often say that in order to root out racism, you need to actually understand the problem and define the problem. If the party at the moment don't even want to do that, then you can't really get anywhere in terms of rooting Islamophobia out. And again, this has been an initiative that has been spearheaded by the MCB and also the APPG for British Muslims, and they have had some success. All of the other main parties have made sure that they recognize Islamophobia and the definition for Islamophobia, but the governing party still has not done that. So again, a mixed solution in terms of an outside group trying to influence in and set the agenda from the inside. So then what is the solution? And how can this improve? So in my opinion, it's not the case that these organizations who are Muslim-led and who have Muslim values have failed. Not at all. They've made very, very, very important strides in the right direction. And so the answer is not less, but more. We need more Muslim-orientated agenda setters and more Muslim-orientated preference shapers. And in a way, our conversation has been too orientated around creating more Muslim MPs and Muslim frontline politicians, when actually that should be the last piece of the jigsaw. Muslim MPs and politicians will feel more comfortable if the agenda that they have set for them or the preferences around them are more in line with Islamic values or the Muslim ethos. So whilst this, getting more Muslims into frontline politics should very much be a priority, it should also be done alongside creating more Muslim groups that can be agenda setters and Muslim groups that can be preference shapers. And I have a bit of hope, as to how that could happen. We've had recently a number of organizations that have sprung up, in the last 2, 3, 4 years, who have specifically been formed to tackle Muslim issues exclusively. And that has come as a result of the fact that Muslims now make up a large enough percentage of the population to have businesses and companies exclusively tailored to meet the Muslim market. And that's a good thing. So this Muslim population increase has brought with it an increase in the number of organizations who could be important agenda setters and preference shapers moving forward. So in the world of finance, you have this group called Wahid Invest, Sharia compliant investing. You have Algebra, which is what it calls itself a sustainable banking movement, but again influenced by Islamic principles. You have Nomo, which is a digital Sharia compliant banking group as well. So these are some examples of groups that have been formed specifically to sort of cater for the Muslim audience. And let's use Algebra for an example. Algebra were recently contacted by the UK government in terms of giving an opinion on Islamic finance. So this is an example of how a third-party entity, Algebra, has been asked by the UK government to give their opinions on a matter such as Islamic finance, and they are then changing the perception or shaping the agenda of what the UK government can do when it comes to the topic of Islamic finance. In terms of the environment, you've got this pressure group called 2 Billion Strong, an organization that realizes that as Muslims we have a duty to be stewards on the earth, and that we are big in number. There are 2 billion of us across the globe, and we can use that power to our advantage to change government attitudes and policies towards the environment. And you have a number of different organizations when it comes to boosting Muslim capacity development. The Aziz Foundation, that sponsors a lot of work in trying to boost the capacity of young Muslims. The GMW Network. The Avicenna Foundation, that provides scholarships to young Muslim students to get them through university for free. The Muslims in Public Policy platform, which gathers together Muslims in the civil service and who work in public policy and tries to ensure that, they get access to Muslim members of parliament to talk about things that they believe from a faith perspective. So, this is a very, very small, almost a microcosm of the number of organizations out there that have a Muslim focus. But the good news is that they're increasing in number, and they may well have a very, very important role to play in shaping the agenda moving forward. With population increase, hopefully, will come an increase in shaping the political agenda. So, in terms of my conclusion then, at the moment, and the key there is at the moment, I am unsure whether faith can be maintained in frontline politics. Remember, though, I define politics as quite broad. I didn't say that politics is MPs or mayors. I said it is the art of making decisions as individuals or as groups of people about how to allocate power or allocate resources. But when it comes to frontline politics, I think that it is a challenge at the moment, personally, I would find it, to maintain my faith in frontline politics. But provided that the number of Muslim individuals or bodies, provided that that increases and they have greater influence either as agenda setters or preference shapers, that will enable Muslims to firstly root out Islamophobia from politics, the internal challenge, but it will also potentially enable Muslims to use their faith to influence policy, which deals with the external challenge as well. But even, that said, under a democratic system, right, where you have different influences, there will never ever be a perfect system. But at the end of the day, it doesn't matter whether there's a democracy or not, even in a theocracy, where you have a religion or a religious body that dictates the way a country should be run, even that's not perfect as well. So maybe this idea of perfectly balancing your faith with politics is just a utopia that you can't really aim for, and you have to make the best of the situation you're in. So, you might be thinking at this point that the MMK Academy does a lot of work in trying to increase access to politics for Muslims, but this guy's just said that at the moment it might be quite difficult to maintain faith in politics. How do the two go together? And the reason why the two go together is we still need to increase the access of young people to the political scene because, firstly, it allows them to build a phenomenal network. And whether they choose to use that network for political means or other means is irrelevant, but building networks is very, very important. And that's part of what we do in the MMK Academy. We help to grow people's networks, which will definitely help them later on down the line. It's also a great learning experience to be exposed to these politicians. And if you get a week's work experience with an MP, you learn a lot. Often you learn that maybe this isn't the space for you, or maybe, that you might find it a bit more challenging to balance your faith with politics, but the learning needs to happen with experience. You can't be told that simply this isn't a space you should get involved in. Experience is very, very important to formulating people's views about whether they can balance their faith with politics. And remember, as we defined at the beginning, faith and politics are very, very broad terms. So whilst one person may find it very difficult balancing their faith with their politics, another person might find it a bit easier or have a viewpoint where the two are a bit more reconcilable. The important point is we need to ensure that Muslims have greater access, because for far too long they haven't at all. And I keep on mentioning this point that at the moment it might be difficult to balance your faith with politics, but in the future, if the number of these Muslim-led or Muslim value-based organizations increase, and the number of Muslim MPs increase as well, then maybe in the future the landscape will be a bit more conducive to Muslims getting involved in politics and being able to maintain their faith at the same time. Whilst I was doing this talk, Iqbal Uncle sent me an article. He always sends some very, very interesting articles. And I thought I'd add these two questions in at the end. The article he sent me was about the 6 new BRICS. I don't know if you've seen, but last week, the 5 BRIC countries, so Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, invited 6 other nations to form, come and get involved in the BRICS. And 4 out of these 6 countries were Muslim. So you had Iran, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Egypt, I believe. Is it Egypt? Egypt, yeah. Ethiopia and Argentina, who were invited. So essentially what political commentators are saying about this is that this new BRICS organization could potentially be more powerful than the G7. And the G7 have been heralded as this group who are the 7 most powerful economies in the world. But there's been a Western dominance or a Western sort of focus of this G7 nations. The BRICS could be a group who might have, and I reckon will have, a huge amount of influence on the way that we do our politics going forward in the UK. And with 4 out of these 6 new BRICS being Muslim countries, could that change the way that we view certain policies in the UK? So, on a very, very trivial level, look at how our views on Saudi Arabia in the UK have mellowed down significantly just because they've invested a lot more in football. In this country, the politicians were hugely skeptical of Saudi Arabia for their human rights abuses, for the fact that they had backward views on women. But suddenly, now that they've invested a huge amount in football and have bought the likes of Newcastle United and the fact that the Saudi Premier League has come up, yes, you have some people who are very critical, but a lot of other people have mellowed their view to Saudi Arabia, and that is a very simple example of how society is slowly changing based off a country's power and influence. So that's the first question. With a changing geopolitical landscape and Muslim-majority countries gaining more power and influence, how will that influence our politics in the UK, and will that make it a bit easier for Muslims to get involved in UK politics and balance their faith at the same time? And the second question, I think, which is fascinating, and unfortunately I don't really have an answer to at the moment, but I think it's worth posing, is with this AI revolution, which will completely flip the way that we know politics. And just look at the next US election for example of that. Will that make it more easier or more challenging to maintain your faith in politics? I think that's just a whole minefield that I haven't really had time to talk about in this talk, but potentially for a future talk, the impact of AI and the changing geopolitical landscape in trying to maintain our UK politics with faith. So thank you very, very much for your time. I hope that this has been interesting. I haven't sought to sort of provide an unequivocal answer. That would be unfair. What I've hoped to do is pose some questions, allow you to think about this topic in a bit more depth. And, you know, next time someone says, well, politics and faith shouldn't mix, hopefully this talk can give you a different view on that. Or maybe next time someone says, we definitely need to get more Muslims as mayors in frontline politics again, you know, maybe this gives you a bit more of a nuanced view on this topic. So the purpose of this talk was mainly to plant the questions and hopefully give you a bit more to think about. And I've also offered my views along the way as well. So thank you very much. And I'd love to hear any questions you have. Thank you.
Salawat ala Muhammad. Thank you very much. We have a few minutes for questions if there are any, and we'll take, I'm sure there are going to be quite a few, but we'll just try and take a few for now.
In your lecture, you said that we could use 2 billion Muslims around the globe to help Islam grow in this world. But these 2 billion Muslims are not just separated due to government, but separated due to country and border. So how would you join them?
Very, very good question. Very, very good. What's your name?
Ilyas.
Ilyas. Okay, fantastic. So, really good question, Ilyas. So, have you heard of Greta Thunberg before? You know Greta Thunberg? Who is Greta Thunberg? You know the one who organised those marches for climate or against climate change. So she's the one who took Fridays off from school and used to take students to go on marches against climate change. You know the one? I've got a photo of her somewhere here. I mention her because I think she'd be quite important to answer. You've heard of her. She's this one, the girl in the photo. So what she did was she realised that, okay, my school might only have 30 children. Another school might have 30 children. Another school in the UK might have another 30 children. And we're all really, really far away from each other. But if I start to protest and I give the idea to someone in the UK, she was based in Sweden. So if I in Sweden go out to protest and I share that idea with someone in the UK and someone in the UK then shares that idea with someone in America, then together we can make a global movement. So we can do a worldwide movement. So it's not really the case of getting everyone together in one position or one place, but it's if one person has one idea in this country, they can share it with someone in the UK, and then they can share it with someone in America, and that's how you make a whole global change. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. As well, I have another question.
Because there's so many questions, we're going to ask other
You can come and ask me after. I'd be very, very interested. Thank you, though, for the question.
Assalamu alaikum, Mohammad Mahdi.
Alaikum salam.
Thank you so much. It's a really interesting talk. Just a little bit of a comment. You know, when you talk about maintaining faith, and in the politicians that you mentioned, you highlight the issue of LGBTQ.
Yeah.
But surely maintaining the faith is a lot more than just,
correct.
You know, whether we support that movement or don't support that movement, but whether we alleviate poverty. You know, we talk about these values that Muslims are good at and known for. And I sometimes feel that we confine ourselves or defining whether we're faithful or not, or we're people of faith or not, by how we vote on this issue. But maybe we should start thinking about how we talk about alleviating poverty, improving education, you know, improving healthcare. And those should be Muslim values that apply to everyone, rather than just talking about maintaining faith on how we vote on this particular issue.
Correct. And that's an excellent question there, too. I think I chose the focus of this to be narrowly looking at maybe a more insular view of maintaining our faith with politics, and not necessarily looking at the broader picture of how our faith can influence the healthcare system and alleviating poverty. Because in my experience, that was almost a get out of jail clause for a lot of the politicians. So when you asked Muslim politicians, how do you balance your faith with politics? They would often say, well, it allows me to practice my faith because I get to alleviate poverty, or because I get to make the health in this country better. And that might be absolutely true, but often the deeper level question of, well, on a practical level, you might be saying these things which sound fancy, but on a deeper level, can you practically maintain your faith whilst doing that as well? I do think, your point is very, very good, and almost another lecture as well as to the second part of this is, how do our values influence UK society and make UK society better? But I feel that that's been talked about a little bit before, and I've heard a bit on it before about how British values and Islamic values, or Islamic values can make British values enhanced and stuff like that. I wanted to talk at it from a deeper level, to talk about, okay, when you actually get in this position and when we create more Muslim MPs, then when they're at the helm, are they able to, balance their faith with politics? Because it's all well and good them trying to alleviate poverty and them trying to fight for a fairer NHS, but it simply takes one issue like the LGBT agenda for Hamza Yusuf to get grilled, or for Tim Farron to resign. And they could put in so much hard work and effort in trying to get into a position where they influence society for the better, but it can be these examples that sort of are the crux for them, if that makes sense. So, yeah.
We'll take a couple more questions.
Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam.
Brilliant lecture, thank you, Mohammed.
No, thank you.
Two quick questions. The first one is, when you talk about balancing faith with kind of politics, is the constraints around the way you talk about it in terms of voting on particular issues, is that constrained to the fact that you're saying, did they vote that the national picture should reflect their own personal principles, or did they vote on the basis that their personal principles should be acceptable in society? So, for example, should they, whatever, I'm not going to use the LGBTQ example, but let's say they voted on abortion law. So the idea of being able to choose whether that's acceptable in the wider society versus whether a Muslim is able to freely practice their religion and able to impose their own principles in their life unhindered, even if others choose not to and choose to take other paths. So that question of them voting in a particular way and limiting it to, I will only vote with what I believe my principles mean for me, as opposed to what I think society should do, and that Muslims should be able to act freely in that context, and if they choose to align with their principles, so be it. The best example, I think, is probably, if you look abroad, Jehovah's Witnesses not taking blood transfusions. They can say, well, other people can choose to, if they want to. We just want to be allowed not to choose not to, if we want to. The same with halal meat. The way an animal is slaughtered, we don't mind if people choose to use other means, but we want our mechanism to be facilitated. And I think that limitation of how they're choosing to balance their politics and their faith is quite important in that context. I'll leave the second question, actually.
Sure. You can ask the second one, or do you think, is it linked to?
No, it's fine.
Okay, it's fine. So, I think it's a really good point about, do we make sure that so you might have a personal private view, should the answer simply be, well, okay, I believe that, but we should then let other people do what they believe, if I understood the question right? I think that would be lovely, but if we go back to the idea of Hamza Yusuf, he tried to say, I will not let my faith influence, or I will not let scripture influence my politics. But the way that sort of society was structured and media's persistence meant that he was eventually forced to then share his personal view as well. So in an ideal world, of course, you would say, I believe in this is right for my community, my people, but there are other people out there whom it might be right for them to do other things, and I'm accepting of that. The issue then is that on specific issues like LGBT, the media might sort of keep on persisting you to then give your opinion on an issue, even though you say, okay, I believe this, society should have this, and then your view might, if you say that I believe that the LGBT movement is wrong, you might be then viewed as homophobic, or you might then be viewed as someone who's not the right candidate to represent the country. So I think it would be nice if we could have a society where you as an individual can have a personal view, but also act in the interests of your nation, and you're allowed to hold both of them at the same time. I don't think that's possible, because if you do then give your view honestly, people will come out for you and say, well, that doesn't really align with the majority people's views. Imagine if Hamza Yusuf came out and said what Kate Forbes said the other way around, and said that, I wouldn't have voted in favour. I think that would have limited his chances of becoming First Minister of Scotland. So, I've answered this in quite a long-winded way. I think simply, ideally, yes, what you say would be lovely, but I just don't see the freedom of people saying that I believe this, but I'm happy to work for this, actually occurring in some instances. Does that make sense? Sure.
There are too many people who have questions, so go on, ask someone.
Mahdi, assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam.
Mahdi, obviously, if I accept your point about preference shapers and decision makers, etc., one of the things that you avoided discussing, perhaps, and there may be a reason, is if you look at the German model, where you've got Christian Democrats,
yeah,
labeled as a party which is influenced by Christianity, even though they have a secular society. And they have a proportional representation, which allows parties of different faiths or different beliefs and views to be part of their system. So surely proportional representation in this country could allow a Muslim party to be formed with clear views, such a Christian party or a Jewish party, in a sense. And therefore, when they're making decisions, or when they are asked to make decisions or influence, it's clearly that they're labeled as such, because they are being voted in and they've been given opportunity to be part of the system, and that they should be allowed to do that, and therefore they can hold that faith and make those decisions on that basis. And surely that's something that perhaps we should be considering supporting proportional representation. It's something you didn't touch on.
Sure.
But yet that works. It has pros and cons.
Yes.
But it could be one of the solutions.
It could well be, and again, excellent question. I definitely did consider it, just a question of time, and I thought I'd focus on our system at the moment. But proportional representation is potentially a way. The caveat I'd have with that is that do we want Muslim values to be confined to a party, or do we want... The idea with preference shapers and agenda setters is that they set agendas and preferences so that, regardless of the party in the UK, they think that that's right. And so we don't necessarily need a Muslim-only party. So, if you think of certain issues, let's take the example of racism. No party at the moment, right, would think that it's acceptable to be racist. And that has come about as a result of campaigns by groups over the last 50 years, and they've now established racism as something that is not tolerated by any side. Same thing with the LGBT agenda. Whether you're Labour or Conservative or Lib Dem or SNP, generally your party line is that we need to be in support of this. That's where the power of preference shapers and agenda setters come in, that they can set the narrative so that in a society, no party would think it's acceptable for Islamophobia to exist. No party would think that all parties would be willing to drive forward with Islamic finance student loans, etc. So proportional representation could be an answer. My only downside with that is then you'd be siloing the Muslim view to a party rather than making the Muslim agenda acceptable to all parties, if that makes sense. It is the difficulty. Yes. Correct. No, absolutely. Is there one more from Iqbal? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for this very, very thoughtful reflections on your experience. The three things which I want to bring to the table, four things actually. One is, when Sadiq Khan was an MP for Tooting, we had he was close to the MCB then. We had a discussion with him, and he said to us, look, I have a request from a constituent to help him to get planning permission for a pub. He's my constituent. I don't drink, I don't agree to drinking, but what shall I do? He said, this is the kind of dilemmas we will come across over and over and over through this career. And you can see as a mayor, he's facing even more. So that's one. And you have highlighted those challenges well. The second one is that in terms of influence, one of the more little known things which we have done at the MCB was to campaign for the inclusion of the religious question in the census. So 2011 was the first one, and they didn't want to put it in 2022. Again, we insisted. This has opened up the way for analysis of how the Muslim community is faring, better, worse, etc., etc., which you can see. So as you see, these are the kind of preference setters. We define the field, nothing Islamic, we're just saying we want religious question. Although they didn't make it mandatory, it is voluntary, but still it is answered by quite a majority of the people. The third thing is, you have not brought on the table Baroness Warsi.
Yes.
Baroness Warsi is a very interesting example of a completely conservative politician, totally sidelined, and then her famous statement that Islamophobia has become dinner table talk.
Yeah.
But that shows her experience, deep experience, as to what happens inside the cabinet room. Because she was in the cabinet. Okay. Lastly, as you mentioned Saudi Arabia and things, you could see, I think we need to do a case study of the World Cup in Qatar. And again, the LGBT question there, and how the politics played out. So yes, there are opportunities, but we need long-term vision and intervention at a stage where slowly, like the census, you can provide data for other things.
Sure.
And so I think those are the observations I have.
Sure. Do you mind if I quickly, 1 minute, is that okay? Comment? Yeah. So first point about Sadiq Khan. That was one of my earliest experiences of him, because at the election, he had a choice between, basically there was a pub in his local constituency, and that pub was the heart and soul of that constituency. And they were looking to close that pub down. And one of the things he campaigned for in 2015 was to keep that pub open. And that was one of the first questions. I'm glad you raised it, actually, because that was one of the first times I began to think, it's great that he represents us, but would I do the same in keeping a pub open? And, his view was that I'm here to use my values to represent what's best for the society, and the pub forms an integral part of that village, or not village, Tooting, that area. So he voted in his conscience, or he decided in his conscience to try and keep that pub open. Your second point was about the census, absolutely right. I use the MCB census quite a bit in my research. So Faith in Numbers in 2011 is a great report if you haven't read that. And there's a recent one in 2021 where I got the 6.5% figure from as well. So please do read that as well. Thirdly, Baroness Warsi, absolutely spot on with that. I was thinking of actually talking a bit more about her resignation, because she resigned both from a moral perspective but influenced by her faith on the issue of Israel-Palestine. Again, that discussion could last quite a bit of time as well. And fourth question on Qatar. I think that's really interesting because, yes, the likes of Gary Lineker, Match of the Day, certain politicians in this country did have a big backlash against Qatar's LGBT views. But at the same time, I heard a conversation from some journalists, some wings of the media that I hadn't heard before, in sort of saying that, well, that's their view, let them do that. And suddenly the landscape was becoming a bit more tolerant to the Muslim perspective of, as Mohammed Uncle mentioned, well, I have my view, you have your view, I will subscribe to my view, but I'll facilitate your view. This idea of, well, Qatar has their view, the UK has their values, we can let the two coexist together. And that was the first time that I'd heard that debate. Before, all I'd heard was that if you're anti this, then you're homophobic, for example. So I think it works both ways, that there was a lot of outroar, but at the same time, it was an interesting debate as well. But thank you for the points.
Thank you very, very much for that really interesting talk. There's been lots of interest. I'm sure lots of people will come and approach you afterwards. Allah salawat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. Brothers and sisters, we have lots of programs which take place on a weekly basis. If you'd like to find out more, please do visit our website, sikkim.org.uk, where all our programs are listed.